All right, we are back here. Championship Sunday in the books. Super Bowl 59 matchup is set. We got another rematch as the Chiefs and Eagles are set to square off in New Orleans on February 9th. But we'll set the stage for that today. Close the book on Championship Sunday. Start getting ready for Super Bowl with a great guest of the podcast, and he's been here a lot over the years. And it's become a tradition we start to talk around this time. Russell Baxter, Pro Football Guru himself, is here. Russell, welcome back. How are you?
Hello there, sir. How are you?
Doing pretty good here. And obviously, I was locked in Championship Sunday here. We know the first game was not a great game. Second game, much more interesting here. What was your big takeaways from Championship Sunday?
Well, I thought even though it looked like Philly was going to pull away a couple of times, the Commanders did hang tough. Okay, and then ultimately the mistakes cost them. And, you know, we saw maybe a glimmer of their inexperience. But my goodness, they went from 4 wins to 14 wins, including the playoffs. In 1 year. They have had their problems regardless of the coaching staff with the Eagles for the last couple of years and so on. And give credit to the Eagles on how they've turned their year around. You know, 4 games into the season, they were 2-2. They squandered the Monday night game against Atlanta. They got pretty rolled by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers down in Tampa. And they've lost 1 game since then. And it was Washington's comeback win in December. So Saquon Barkley is having that kind of a year, approaching the overall record for most rushing yards in the season. Now, you can have fun with that depending on how many games. I think Terrell Davis holds the top spot. He's also closing in on something I find to be a fascinating record, is the most rushing yards by one player in a postseason. And that was during the 1982 strike when John Riggin had 4 straight 100-yard games, and Washington won Super Bowl 17 over Miami. Terrell Davis, I want to say the 97 run, again, 4 games, and Saquon's going to play in 4 games. So can he get to 610? More importantly, can they knock off the Chiefs? And talk about familiarity. I believe this is the 4th year in a row, including Super Bowls, that these teams are going to see each other.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts to think about that here. And I want to stick on this NFC game a minute here, because obviously I think one of the things that sort of was interesting here was, like, we had let's talk about the momentum Washington had, the big upset of Detroit. And then I don't know why it felt like this game, like whether it was some self-inflicted mistakes or whether it was, just not being physical enough on defense against the run. I know they missed some guys up front. There's a big difference here. But, like, the NFC title game, I mean, it felt like to me this is a spot where sort of like the clock struck midnight in the Commanders, where, like, they had this great run and then they said, oh, wait, not happening anymore. So I think that was interesting to see, sort of like they had a great year, but, like, it's something like, I know the line talked about this last year about how, like, you're not guaranteed to get back here. And then I know Commander fans today are very happy about the year they had, but you always are going to regret when you get that close and can't get the job done.
Well, listen, Mike, they have one very, very fatal flaw, and that's being 30th against the run. Okay, Detroit did go nuts on them in terms of running the football. Jahmyr Gibbs had a big day, even though Detroit lost. Detroit turned over the ball 5 times and so on. But it's not like the Washington give up yards. Remember, last year they were the worst defense in the league. They gave up the 3rd most points in an NFL season in history. Now it's the 4th most points because Carolina set a new NFL record this year. And we've seen that in the last couple of years. Anyway, when you're that bad against the run, you can be that bad against everything, because once a team's able to establish the run, and the tone was set in a way very early. Remember, Washington had the ball, 17 plays, 54 yards, field goal. Philadelphia, 1 play, 60 yards, touchdown. And, they were kind of swimming upstream for the most part. But again, they hung tough for as long as they could. But again, 4 turnovers. Eagles didn't have any. It's been a big year in the playoffs for teams not turning over the ball. Only 2 of the 12 winning teams had a turnover in this playoffs and still managed to win the game. Houston and the Chiefs on Sunday.
Yeah, speaking of the Chiefs on Sunday here, I know all the attention is going to go to, like, that 4th down play that the Bills already should have gotten the 1st down. They didn't get. Kansas City scores a touchdown and wins the game here. Like, I know people say, oh, like, referee, so on and so forth. But to me, like, there were a lot of other ways Buffalo lost that football game. That helped? No. But I think, like, they had opportunities to win this game and did not take advantage of it with some, like, just whether it was questionable, like, allocation of giving James Cook not enough touches, whether it was chasing 2 points too early. I feel like the Bills really shot themselves in the foot a lot in this game.
Yeah, I question a couple of their fourth down calls as well. They seem to have a little momentum on defense, and they could have pinned the Chiefs down in their own territory. Opted to go for it on fourth down. Gave Kansas City a short field. They got a little pressure on Mahomes, but one thing that Patrick Mahomes has done the last couple of years, and I would make the case, Mike, that in Super Bowl 57 against the Eagles and Super Bowl 58 against the 49ers, Patrick Mahomes' biggest plays came with his legs. And we saw it again on Sunday. He ran the ball a lot. He had 2 rushing touchdowns, I believe. So, there's a certain pocket persona about him because he's such a great passer. But he's done a lot with his legs in the postseason. He knows when to pick his moments. It reminds me a lot of Joe Montana. Okay? Joe Montana, for a long time, you'll laugh at this. For a long time, Joe Montana held the rushing record for a quarterback in the Super Bowl. They played the Miami Dolphins Super Bowl 19 in Palo Alto. And what Joe Montana did is once he felt the rush, he immediately took off. And once he did that, it kept the Dolphin defense off balance. So let's also keep something in mind here. These teams know each other very, very well. And we would be almost forgetful to remember how long Andy Reid has known Sean McDermott. I mean, they go back more than 2 decades. So do you think Andy Reid knows a little bit about what Sean McDermott likes to do?
Yeah, I'm sure he does here. And I do think also interesting to note here is, like, I was looking at some of the numbers in this game here. I mean, James Cook averages 6.5 yards a carry, only runs the ball 13 times. I feel like that's a bad allocation of, like touches for a guy who was, I think, the most effective skill player that the Bills had.
Oh, I agree. And a lot of that came up. I think he had a 33-yard run around left end. And I was surprised they didn't give him the ball a little more because that actually was the winning formula against Baltimore. And Buffalo did that against Baltimore, who had the number 1 run defense in the league. They were very, very patient. They were not as patient in the AFC Championship game. And I think that came back to haunt them a little. And, call it panic, call it, just being maybe a little intimidated with what happened to them in the playoffs against the Chiefs. You look at the 4 playoff games the Chiefs have had against the Bills, and they've had no problem at all scoring points on Buffalo's defense, be it 4 years ago and be it on Sunday. So Josh Allen this, Josh Allen that, I get it. But I think there was an essence of panic in the Bills on Sunday.
I think I agree with that here, too, because you look at the numbers here, they're stark. I mean, people don't realize, like Buffalo has won the last 4 regular season meetings between these 2 teams, like they're split between the 2 stadiums. But, like, when the playoffs get here and, like, the stakes raise, it seems like they sort of, like, either go away from what they do best or they try and do weird things. It's like, it's really feels very mental with this team, specifically against these guys. And, like, I know it's how great how Josh Allen is. He has yet to win a road playoff game. And even guys like Mark Sanchez won 4 and he hasn't won any. And, like, this, I don't know what it is. Something with when they see these guys in January, they sort of, like, get away from what they do well. It feels like that mental hurdle this team has to overcome if they're going to get to where they want to go.
Well, I mean, think about this. Up until Sunday, the last time the Chiefs had turned over the ball, Mike, was against the Bills in the regular season. Patrick Mahomes threw 2 interceptions, and they lost their first game of the year. The Chiefs then won 8 consecutive games without a turnover. Okay? They turned over the ball again in this game, and it didn't matter. And yet, and here you want to talk about astounding, okay? Buffalo, who cleaned up its act this year. Okay, last year alone, Josh Allen turned over the ball 22 times. Okay? They, as a team, in the regular season, Mike, turned over the ball 28 times. This year, the Buffalo Bills tied the NFL record for fewest turnovers in the season by a game, 8, which was originally set by the 49ers in 2018. Now, consider this. Not only did the Bills play one more regular season game, they also played 3 playoff games. So in 20 games this year, Buffalo turned over the ball 8 times. 8 times. By the way, all of them by Josh Allen. No one else on the team had a turnover. And yet, couldn't get to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it's a wild sight to think about here. And we have the Super Bowl matchup set now with the Chiefs and Eagles. Obviously, they met 2 years ago. If James Barry doesn't commit the PI penalty there, you may have a chance of this week going to overtime, becoming the highest scoring Super Bowl in history. It's third most overall at this point here. So interesting that we get a rematch 2 years later, and Eagles feel like they're very different from where we saw them 2 years ago, whereas the Chiefs feel like pretty similar in what regards. What is your early thoughts on this matchup?
Well, I think the team from 2 years ago was very explosive. Patrick Mahomes in 2022 had one of the great overall seasons in NFL history by a quarterback. Okay? He was also, remember that year, he was the first quarterback and still remains, Mike, ready for this? Because Joe Burrow led the league in passing yards this year, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so one time in 59 years of the Super Bowl has a player led the league in passing yards and won the Super Bowl the same season. That would be Patrick Mahomes in 2022.
Yeah.
Okay, Patrick Mahomes was also the first league MVP to win the Super Bowl the same season since Kurt Warner 24 years earlier, Super Bowl 34. So you go back and look at some of the great, Marino in 84 and Montana in 89. 2022, Patrick Mahomes was pretty sensational. And their defense wasn't quite what it was these past 2 seasons. I mean, Jalen Hurts ran for 3 touchdowns. Jalen Hurts also had a critical turnover, a scooped up fumble that the Chiefs scored on, and so on when Philly had 11 members. And Philly had a 10-point lead and couldn't hold it. So I think that these teams are different. I think Philly, even though the offensive line lost Jason Kelsey from last year, they haven't missed a beat. They've finished second in the league. Listen, Philadelphia was second in the league in running and has the top-ranked defense in the league. That's the turnaround with Philadelphia. That's what's going to be interesting. Last year, the Philly fell apart at the end of the year. Remember, their defense against the pass was next to last in the league. This year, it's number 1 in the league. So they've done, I think this is a different Philly team. If you would have said that 4 weeks in the season, I would agree. They look like they picked up where they lost last year, almost like lethargic. But I think they've grown. I think the offensive line is settled in. Jalen Carter's having one of those kind of years on the defensive front. So I think it's going to be a different kind of game. And remember, they played in the regular season last year in Kansas City, and Philly beat them on a Monday night in Kansas City. So it was funny. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but going back to when Andy Reid coached the Eagles and then coached the Chiefs, every time there was a Philadelphia-Kansas City game, Mike, Andy Reid was on the winning side, whether he was with the Eagles or whether he was with the Chiefs, and that ended last year on that Monday night. Now we'll see if he picks up where he left off and so on. So it's a fascinating matchup. I did a piece for Fansided about Super Bowl rematches. I mean, there's only ever been one back-to-back years, and that was Dallas and Buffalo. But this almost has kind of a sense of, pardon me, less like the Chiefs and the 49ers, because remember, that was a different quarterback battle. It's Jimmy Garoppolo and then Brock Purdy. Kind of reminds me a little, now I'm not going to go deep historic in terms of the game, but Pittsburgh and Dallas in the 70s. Okay, they met each other in 75. They met each other in 78. 78, there was something like 25 Hall of Fame players, future Hall of Fame players in that game. So I'm not comparing it that way. But the fact that you've got the same quarterback and the same head coaches that you did from just 2 years ago. I think it makes it more on that vein, and very much like the Dallas-Buffalo matchup in 92 and 93. Now, it was interesting. Pittsburgh won both games. Dallas won both games. More times than not, these quote-unquote rematches go the way of the team that won the first game. But the Eagles have Saquon Barkley. And again, he's having one of those. He's having, I mentioned John Riggins. He's having kind of like a Terrell Davis year in 1997 when the Broncos won it as a wild card.
Yeah, that definitely is stuff. Get back to Saquon in a second here. I think the interesting thing you brought about last year's game here is that was sort of like the high water point for the Eagles last season, where they have all this emotion. They go to Kansas City, they get the revenge, they win the next week, and then they lose 5 of their last 6 games, including the playoffs here. So it's interesting that like sort of like they sort of had their moments like, we did it, now what? And then they sort of like faded down the stretch, and that's sort of like is interesting to see how they've evolved year to year. Whereas now like they obviously Sirianni changed coordinators in the offseason and they brought some new guys in, but like there is like a little bit of a different mentality, I think, with the Eagles now compared to where they were in the middle of last year.
I think, yeah. I mean, that's what I was saying about early this year. So think about what you said. They lost 5 of their last 6, and then they split their first 4 games. So it was almost like the hangover effect. And we've seen, that happens with teams. We saw the Chargers make the playoffs in 2022, and then they went to Jacksonville, and then they were up 27-0 in the second quarter, and then they lost. And a year later, they never really recovered from that, and it cost Brandon Staley his job. And of course, they rebounded this year with Jim Harbaugh. But when Philly went down to Tampa last year in the playoffs and were absolutely 32-9.
Yeah,
their defense. Their defense was absolutely horrific the last month and a half, and it cost them dearly. But I'm really looking forward to this. Not that I don't look forward to every Super Bowl, but obviously there's some history ramifications with the Chiefs and so on. And this kind of weird little nugget. Back in 1984, the San Francisco 49ers became the first team to win 15 regular season games. And then they won the Super Bowl. They beat Miami. A year later, the Bears, 15-1, beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. I don't know what this means, Mike. The last 6 teams, including the Lions this year, to win at least 15 regular season games, didn't win the Super Bowl. Now, can Kansas City snap that streak? Remember, they were 15-2. Now they're 17-2. Listen, we saw an 18-0 team lose the Super Bowl. So, again, I'll be very curious. A lot of familiarity here. The rosters have not changed all that much. I will say this. Late in that Philly game, Zach Ertz pretty much had his way with Philadelphia's defense. Would you agree?
Yeah, I remember he had a huge game that night.
Yeah, and there's I'm trying to remember. There's some guy on the Chiefs who has more catches than anybody else in the history of the playoffs. I've been waiting for years and years and years. Are we ever going to get a tight end named Super Bowl MVP? Just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and another thing about the Eagles situation too is obviously the biggest change, I think, between these two teams over the Super Bowl was obviously Saquon Barkley coming in here, and I think like having him, I feel like they really sort of committed to him. I think right after they go back to New York for his return to MetLife against the Giants, he starts having these huge games here. I feel like having Saquon Barkley has unlocked a lot of the Eagles, where it's sort of forced them to go back to what they do best, where they're run first team, and Hurts sort of like operates off of that. As opposed to, I think towards the end of last year, trying to force Hurts to be like a prolific passing quarterback. I think having this be a run-first identity with Barkley, I think, has unlocked a lot with the Eagle offense that made them so good 2 years ago.
Listen, there's been I know it's a quote-unquote quarterback-centric league, quarterback-focused league, so much emphasis on the quarterback. Go back to when Philadelphia beat New England in the Super Bowl. You could listen, I know Nick Foles got MVP. You could have very easily given it to the offensive line. We've never seen that. Okay?
Yeah. The
stat that always sticks out to me in that game, Mike, is Bill Belichick, Matt Patricia, pretty good defensive staff. Philly ran for 164 yards on Bill Belichick's defense, which Corey Clement, LeGarrette Blount, and Jay Ajayi. And that set the tone of the game. In fact, Philly is in the Super Bowl for the 3rd time in 8 years. And what's the real common denominator? It's their offensive line. And that's why Howie Roseman is a borderline genius, because he just keeps finding ways to plug holes, drafting offensive linemen, making trades, being aggressive, getting A.J. Brown a couple of years ago, paying Saquon Barkley. Every time you turn around, you wonder how he does it. But he's the constant. They have now done this 3 times in 8 years with different head coaches and different starting quarterbacks.
Yeah, they have. And the Saquon thing is fascinating, too, because, obviously, we have not seen a Super Bowl MVP running back since Terrell Davis did with the Broncos in the 97 Super Bowl against the Packers here. And it feels like if the Eagles win the Super Bowl here, I feel like Saquon is going to be considered the heavy favorite for the MVP because, he will have to have a big day for the Eagles to win this game.
Listen, Kansas City's got a very respectable defense. I don't think it's as good as it was last year, but they still have very, very solid corners. And there's going to be some great matchups with Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. And, a guy who's really emerged, not that he's a secret or anything like that, but Dallas Goedert had a very, very good second half of the season. And he's really been an outlet guy. Eventually, every once in a while there'll be a dump off to Barkley or Kenneth Gainwell will be involved in the passing game and so on. But Dallas Goedert has really emerged, okay? And that's probably an understatement to a degree because I think he's always been a quality tight end, but he's added a little extra dimension, just like Zach Ertz was a very, very pivotal part of this offense. Tight ends, we have George Kittle and we have Travis Kelce and, Hawkinson and so on. It's almost like they still don't get their due. But Dallas Goedert's a very, very pivotal part of this team and so on. So, I think this is a different kind of matchup than it was 2 years ago. And as we saw, a 38. By the way, the last 3 Super Bowls, all decided by 3 points.
Yeah,
okay.
That's true. And it feels like that's a very typical Chief recipe, too. I know, obviously they're pursuing history. First time the 2-time defending Super Bowl champs gotten back to the Super Bowl. They're looking to become the first 3-peat NFL champion in general since the Packers back in the 60s when they won the NFL title 65 on the first 2 Super Bowls. And then you're sitting here, look at this, the odds this team faces here. I mean, I saw a great story from a friend of the podcast, Mike Sandel, The Athletic, yesterday. The Chiefs have won 17 consecutive one-score games. The odds of that happening are 0.1%, which is absurd. Shows you how good this team is in the clutch. You can argue lucky a little bit for sure, but what do you think about this pursuit of history they have here, where they are going for something we have not seen in the NFL in almost 60 years?
Right, and obviously not during the Super Bowl era, and thank you for bringing up the Packers because for people who want to discount that and don't think it counts, it does count. Okay, it's not the Green Bay Packers' fault that they hadn't formed a Super Bowl yet. Okay, and there's obviously probably some people will say a lot more legitimate than when the Packers did it the first time, Mike, which was 1929 to 1931. There was no postseason in the NFL. There were no playoffs. So the championships were awarded a little differently. Okay. By the way, that Packers team, in case you're thinking the 3 in a row was a fluke, they won 5 NFL titles in 7 years.
Yeah.
Okay. They were really the first, in the 50s, you had the Lions and the Browns, which people will probably scratching their what, the Lions and the Browns? So they each won three titles back then. Okay. And they played each other in the championship constantly. But from 6 when Lombardi was there, Lombardi, who never had a losing season as the head coach, that was really the first 2 times. And then, of course, you had the Steelers in the 70s who won back-to-back Super Bowls twice and, had an amazing 8-year run. And, this is, to me, a dynasty is not winning it every year. You have to have some titles in there, and the Chiefs certainly qualify and so on. They still have a long ways to go, even if they win 3 in a row. They still have a long ways to go to beat that team up in New England, who was, the Patriots from 2001 to 2019. And I don't have to tell you this. somewhat reminiscent of the 49ers during the 80s and half of the 90s, this long, sustained period. And listen, the Chiefs have been in the playoffs 10 consecutive years. They annually now host the AFC title game, even though last year they won it in Baltimore. So we have the makings of history here. But I enjoy the fact that you gave the Packers their due because that's a very, very important part of history. And I'm sure Andy Reid would be the first person to tell you that.
Yeah, I think it's also, no, people don't talk about it enough with the Chiefs, too, is that they've been in the Super Bowl so often. Like, I mean, they've been in the Super Bowl, like, 4 of the last 5 years. Because the only exception was the year the Bengals beat them in the AFC title game and the Rams got there, too. So, like, you're already talking about, like, dynastic stuff where it's 5 out of 6 right now, which is absurd.
Correct. And which exactly that outlies. It was funny. And I used to have this, and I have said this to many people. When New England won 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, okay?
Yeah.
And, yes, it's a dynasty. I didn't think so. And I'll tell you why. Because in 2002, after they won the Super Bowl, they missed the playoffs.
Yeah.
Okay? And they got off to a good start that year and fell in. Now, then the consistency comes. Okay? And then they missed the playoffs again in 2008, even though they had an 11-5 record. But when I think of the Patriots, I think of 2001 to 2019, not 2001 to 2004. Okay? The Cowboys in the 90s, it was more than just winning those Super Bowls in 3 years. They were a competitive team throughout the 90s. Okay? Even though they never got back there, they were still a factor. That is a dynasty. A dynasty is not 3 years. Okay, even the TV show Dynasty lasted more than 3 years.
Yeah, that's true here, and obviously there's a lot to get into with this game here. So, from an X's and O's standpoint, what should we be keeping an eye on here in this game? What are your keys to watch here?
Well, I'll be curious to see what the Chiefs do with their offensive line. I believe Joe Thuney, who's a guard, has been playing some tackle and so on. The thing about Philadelphia's defense. And defensive line. It is talented and it is deep. Okay? When they beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, they didn't get a sack all day, and then they finally got one, I think, from Brandon Graham. And Brady fumbled, and that turned out to be New England's only turnover of the game. But it was critical. Philly kicked an insurance field goal, went up by 8, et cetera, et cetera. That depth on the defensive line paid off. Remember, Tom Brady threw for 505 yards in Super Bowl 52 and wound up losing the game. So that's what I'll be watching, is that play. And Kansas City's, at times, their tackles have been a little shaky. And again, Philly's very deep in that regard. And they're getting seemingly more pass rush from a lot of different aspects now. So I'm not saying they're going to pummel Patrick Mahomes, but there have been some games this year where Patrick took his lumps. There's no question about it. But Andy Reid will come up with something. I have no doubt about it. I mean, I think this is going to be another nail biter that has symbolized the Chiefs this year. It has not necessarily symbolized the Eagles for the most part this year, who have really been, like I said, on an unbelievable run with just that one loss to Washington.
Yeah, that's true here. And last thing I sort of mentioned here is, like, who feels the X factor of this game? I feel like you made a good case that a guy like Dallas Goedert could be a matchup problem with the Chiefs defense here. I feel like there's a lot of things to watch here. Who is the X factor of this game, in your opinion?
I'm going to butcher the young man's name for Kansas City. Their kick returner and punt returner.
Yeah.
I thought he played a enormous role in Sunday's game. He was getting 30-yard returns. Even if he was deep in the end zone, he was getting 30-yard returns. He had, I think, a 41-yard punt return or kickoff return. He had the big return in the Houston game. Remember all the craziness with the penalty and all that stuff? And if you go back to the Super Bowl 2 years ago, there was a big punt return by the Chiefs that swung the momentum of that game late in the fourth quarter. So the Eagles special teams don't get their due a lot of times in the Super Bowl unless it's Adam Vinatieri kicking the game-winning field goal. But I would just keep an eye on Kansas City's return game, because I think that could be something that makes for a short field for Patrick Mahomes. So, by the way, it's a funny history thing. Kansas City's first Super Bowl win came in the city of New Orleans. Yeah. It just wasn't at the Superdome.
Yeah.
It was at Tulane Stadium. Philadelphia's first Super Bowl appearance came in that building in 1980 when they lost to the Raiders, the wild card Raiders.
Yeah, interesting nugget here.
I don't know what that means, but I love that stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting nugget for sure to tie it into the city here. And the kickoff return thing is interesting here because I think you don't really think of many like iconic like returns in the Super Bowl in recent memory. I think the most like recent one I could think of is probably Jacoby Jones and the Super Bowl 47 before the lights went out. That's probably the most recent big return I could think of.
Yeah, you know what's funny is if you go back and look, and I'm trying to call it up here while we're talking. An unbelievable stat when it comes to kickoff return. First off, as you know, there's never been a punt return for a touchdown in the Super Bowl. There have been some long returns in recent years, but there's never been a punt return. Off the top of my head, okay, and I'll correct myself if my file opens up. Mike, I want to say there's been 10 kickoff returns in the history of the Super Bowl for a touchdown, but only 2 have been by a team that won the game.
Yeah, there's 10. I think the only ones that won the game were Percy Harvin and Jacoby Jones.
Well, no, it's Desmond Howard.
Oh, that would be 3 then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm trying to think. I'm just trying to think. I mean, again, I'm not sure my number. That's why I'm opening up my file.
Yeah, it's actually. So yeah, I have the list up for here. The list of 10 guys. There's 4 who were involved in wins. It's Percy Harvin, Jacoby Jones, Jermaine Lewis for the Ravens, and Desmond Howard, as you mentioned.
I think I'm getting my number wrong as far as the winning teams.
Yeah.
It's what happens when you get older.
Yeah.
You know. So, but more time. You know, Stanford Jennings. You know, there's just a whole bunch of instances where you don't see a lot of that. Okay, and it's funny because when you talk about Jacoby Jones and Percy Harvin, those were, I believe, to open up the half.
Yeah, Jacoby Jones opened the second half and right before the lights went out. Percy Harvin, I think, was also the same thing, except the lights didn't go out in life.
Right. And then there it is. No, you're right. Because I've got it written right down. I had 6 of those in the losing effort. So, yeah, there you go. Thank you. All right. And by the way, when they team played each other last time, it was Kadarius Toney who had a 67-yard punt return, which is the longest in Super Bowl history.
All right. Well, we'll see if we get a great special teams play in the Super Bowl. Russell, thanks for all the time. Really appreciate it. People want to follow on social media. Keep on some of your NFL content. How can they do that?
Bax Football Guru on is it X? I got to call it X, I guess, right?
Yeah.
X marks the spot.
Yeah. I think I'm calling it X.
Right. Pro Football Gurus on Instagram, Pro Football Gurus on Facebook. You know, but if you follow me on X/Twitter, everything I write, I tweet out, and I also have a neat page on Facebook called Football Past and Present Seriously. It's not a trash talking page. A lot of history, a lot of notable writers. We have about 3,200 people on our page so far. We're growing. And so on. Follow us there, and you get a lot of good content from a lot of good people.
Sounds good, Russell. Thanks for all the time. Enjoy the game.
All right, Mike. Thanks.